China built a structure so incomprehensibly heavy, it literally altered the physics of our planet, standing not just as a dam, but as a 39 billion ton planetary brake. Most people look at the Three Gorges Dam and see a concrete wall holding back a river, but they are entirely wrong about the true scale of its existence. It acts as the ultimate apocalyptic survival mechanism against a river so violently unpredictable that it has killed hundreds of thousands of people throughout recorded history. To force this aquatic monster into submission, structural engineers poured a literal mountain of marine-grade concrete, stacking enough high-tensile steel to build 63 exact replicas of the Eiffel Tower. Then, in an act of pure, unadulterated engineering arrogance, they trapped 39 trillion kilograms of raging water and physically lifted it 175 meters into the thin air. That was the precise moment the global alarms triggered, and scientists at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory watched their telemetry data in absolute disbelief. You cannot move 39 billion tons of mass without forcing the universe to respond. The Earth is a rotating sphere, and the physics of its rotation are strictly governed by the absolute law of the conservation of angular momentum. When engineers sealed the colossal steel gates, the Yangtze River violently backed up, creating a massive, unnatural reservoir stretching over 600 kilometers through the mountainous terrain. By taking 39 trillion kilograms of water and lifting it significantly further away from the center of the Earth, they artificially increased the planet's moment of inertia. To conserve the total angular momentum of the planet, the Earth's rotational speed physically had to decrease. It is the exact same terrifying physics as an Olympic ice skater throwing their arms outward to abruptly slow their spin, but executed on a planetary, multi-billion-ton scale. The data was aggressively confirmed by independent astronomical observations. The Earth's rotation permanently slowed down by a fraction of a microsecond every single day, and the sheer concentration of localized mass caused the geographic poles of the planet to physically shift by nearly 2 centimeters. Human civil engineering had officially altered the mechanical rotation of the solar system, but this mastery over physics is a deeply terrifying double-edged sword. What human gravity holds back, terrestrial gravity constantly tries to destroy. The immense, suffocating hydrostatic pressure pushing against the upstream face of this concrete leviathan is beyond standard human comprehension. Every single square inch of the lower dam foundation takes hundreds of thousands of pounds of crushing, unrelenting force every second of every day, and it must withstand this pressure forever without a single millimeter of critical failure. Before a single drop of this highly specialized concrete could be poured, the engineering battalions had to completely conquer the Yangtze River, which is not merely a waterway, but a raging, hydraulic monster of unfathomable power. In the summer of 1931, the river broke its banks and triggered a catastrophic flood that wiped out major cities, drowning agricultural heartlands, and killing over 3 million people in a single, devastating season. It remains the third longest river in the world, carrying a staggering 30,000 cubic meters of violent, sediment-heavy water every single second, effectively acting like a continuous, liquid freight train. You cannot simply drop a concrete foundation into water moving with that level of kinetic energy. The current will instantly rip the material away, washing heavy industrial equipment and wet cement downstream before it ever has a chance to cure. The only viable solution was extreme, unprecedented geographical warfare, the total diversion of the mighty river from its ancient, prehistoric bed. Engineers launched a massive, coordinated assault on the surrounding topography, detonating thousands of tons of high-grade industrial explosives to blast through the solid, ancient granite mountains flanking the river. Over 102 million cubic meters of earth and shattered bedrock were violently excavated from the site, utilizing a relentless, mechanized fleet of over 1,000 heavy-duty dump trucks operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their singular, brutal mission was to carve an artificial bypass channel wide and deep enough to force the angry Yangtze completely out of its natural path. Once this massive terrestrial wound was ripped open, they had to construct cofferdams directly in the main river to block the original flow. These cofferdams were not small, temporary barriers. They were massive earthen and steel walls dumped directly into the roaring current. Bulldozers and heavy dump trucks dropped boulders the size of minivans into the churning water, only to watch the river fight back, casually washing 10-ton rocks away as if they were weightless pebbles. To counter the sheer velocity of the water, engineers deployed massive steel tetrahedrons, spiked, heavy metal cages designed to violently interlock with one another and aggressively grip the muddy river floor. Slowly, brutally, and with zero margin for error, the gap closed, the river was choked off, and the water was forced to detour into the newly blasted bypass channel. Behind the safety of the cofferdam, giant industrial dewatering pumps engaged, sucking millions of gallons of trapped water out of the isolated riverbed. And for the first time in millions of years, the bedrock bottom of the Yangtze River was exposed to the open sun, setting the brutal stage for the real construction war to begin. Concrete is inherently weak in tension, and a single, microscopic crack in a dam tasked with holding back 39 billion tons of water is an absolute, non-negotiable death sentence for millions of people living downstream. The Three Gorges Dam demanded an incomprehensible 27 million cubic meters of concrete, a volume so massive that if it were poured using traditional methods, the ensuing chemical reaction would generate so much internal thermal energy that the dam would literally cook itself from the inside out. The resulting thermal expansion would catastrophically shatter the entire structure into useless rubble long before the reservoir water ever touched its face. To prevent this thermodynamic disaster, engineers had to completely reinvent the entire process of how concrete is mixed, cooled, and poured on a mega-industrial scale. They constructed the world's largest automated concrete batching plants directly onto the towering cliffs above the site, completely revolutionizing the supply chain of liquid stone. The concrete itself was strictly temperature-controlled to a terrifying degree. Engineers used massive refrigeration plants to chill the raw aggregate with liquid nitrogen and mixed the cement with millions of tons of industrial fly ash to deliberately slow down the exothermic curing process. As the massive concrete blocks were being poured, laborers embedded a highly complex, internal vascular system of high-density steel pipes directly into the core of the structure. Freezing river water was continuously pumped through this vascular network to artificially extract the heat radiating from the curing concrete, essentially functioning as an artificial, circulatory cooling system for a massive, man-made mountain. The pouring process itself was a relentless ballet of heavy industrial machinery. Colossal tower cranes, mounted on heavy-duty rail tracks, hoisted 20-ton buckets of chilled concrete hundreds of feet into the air, while miles of automated conveyor belts fed continuous, uninterrupted streams of wet mix directly into the massive steel forms. They poured the dam in massive, isolated vertical blocks, strictly limiting the maximum lift height to ensure perfect thermal control. As the concrete flowed in, workers wielding high-frequency industrial vibrators violently compacted the slurry, forcing every single trapped air bubble out of the matrix to ensure absolute zero voids and absolute zero tolerance for structural defects. One single void means a localized pressure point. A localized pressure point guarantees a stress fracture, and a stress fracture will inevitably trigger a catastrophic structural blowout. To prevent this, specialized inspectors armed with advanced ultrasonic scanners continuously probed every single poured block, and if any section failed the rigorous density test, heavy hydraulic breakers were immediately brought in to violently smash the defective concrete to dust, so it could be completely repoured from scratch. Through this agonizing, meticulous process, the wall slowly rose from the bedrock, topping out at 185 meters high, stretching over 2 kilometers long, and boasting a massive base thickness of 115 meters, a brutalist, impenetrable monolith permanently locked into the deep granite bedrock. However, standard marine-grade concrete alone cannot possibly withstand the violent, shifting kinetic energy and relentless hydrostatic pressure of the trapped Yangtze River. It requires an internal skeleton of unyielding strength. Buried deep inside the concrete matrix is a heavily armored skeleton forged from nearly 500,000 metric tons of high-tensile structural steel. Armies of specialized welders worked around the clock, suspended hundreds of feet in the freezing air, battling extreme coastal winds and dangerous construction conditions to fuse this massive grid together. Every single critical rebar connection and structural weld was meticulously inspected using industrial X-ray machinery, and if a weld contained even a microscopic slag inclusion or an invisible hairline fracture, it was immediately cut out and completely re-welded. This massive, interwoven steel grid is what gives the Three Gorges Dam its crucial tensile strength, allowing the colossal concrete wall to slightly flex and breathe under the unimaginable weight of the water. A perfectly rigid concrete structure of this magnitude would simply snap under the shifting loads, but the steel allows the megastructure to dynamically absorb and redistribute the punishing forces. Yet, merely holding back the water is only half of the terrifying engineering equation. The dam was ultimately designed to harvest the violent kinetic energy of the river and convert it into raw electrical power. Deep inside the concrete fortress, the dam houses 32 main hydroturbine generators, each one an absolute mechanical beast weighing an astonishing 6,000 tons. The massive steel scroll casings, giant, snail-shaped tubes designed to aggressively funnel high-pressure water directly into the turbines, measure over 14 meters in diameter. When the intake gates are opened, the highly pressurized water from the massive reservoir rushes into these steel veins at terrifying, bone-crushing speeds, violently slamming into the massive bronze runner blades of the Francis turbines. The overwhelming kinetic energy of the rushing water physically forces the massive turbines to spin with devastating force, transferring this unstoppable rotational energy directly through a massive steel shaft to the generator's rotor. The rotor, functioning as a colossal electromagnet the size of a 5-story building, spins continuously inside the fixed stator, and the rapidly changing magnetic flux violently induces massive amounts of raw, alternating electrical current. When all 32 massive units are running at maximum capacity, the Three Gorges Dam violently detonates 22,500 megawatts of electricity directly into the Chinese national grid. It is the equivalent power output of 15 massive nuclear reactors, generated entirely by capturing, enslaving, and weaponizing the raw, unstoppable fury of the deadliest river on the planet. Despite its immense power, you cannot permanently trap the entirety of the Yangtze River. especially during the violent summer flood season when the incoming water flow massively exceeds the maximum intake capacity of the hydro turbines. If the reservoir water is allowed to uncontrollably overtop the crest of the dam, it will violently cascade down the downstream face, rapidly eroding the foundational bedrock and ultimately causing the entire $31 billion structure to catastrophically collapse. The dam must be able to aggressively release this immense hydraulic pressure on command, and it executes this critical function through its massive, heavily reinforced spillway system. The central spillway is arguably the most violent and dangerous section of the entire megastructure, equipped with 22 massive surface sluice gates and 23 heavily armored deep outlet gates. When the emergency protocols demand these steel gates to open, the resulting water release is absolutely terrifying, ejecting over 100,000 cubic meters of water every single second into the open air. That sheer volume of water contains enough raw kinetic energy to instantly pulverize the concrete floor of the riverbed and completely dig out the dam's foundation within hours. To neutralize this destructive force, fluid dynamic engineers designed complex ski jump spillways. As the massive volume of water shoots down the steep concrete channels at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, it does not simply crash into the bottom of the river. Instead, the lip of the concrete spillway curves sharply upward at the very end. This precise geometric curve acts as a massive ramp, violently launching the roaring water over 100 meters straight up into the air. In midair, the massive, solid sheet of water violently shatters into billions of individual droplets, aggressively mixing with the atmosphere in a process called aeration. The terrifying kinetic energy of the water is almost entirely dissipated through mid-air friction and aerodynamic drag before the mist ever harmlessly crashes back into the riverbed below. It is a true masterpiece of applied fluid dynamics, transforming a localized apocalypse of water into a perfectly controlled, heavily engineered mid-air explosion. Yet, while the engineers successfully chained the water, they also completely severed the golden waterway of China, cutting off vital cargo ships from navigating the river. To solve this logistical nightmare, they had to invent a way for massive industrial vessels to physically climb a 113-meter vertical wall of solid concrete. They constructed a massive, 5-tier ship lock system, but moving a ship through it takes 4 agonizing hours, which was deemed far too slow for critical, time-sensitive cargo. Their ultimate solution was the construction of the Three Gorges ship lift, an absolute marvel of mechanical engineering acting as the largest and heaviest elevator ever built by humanity. The ship lift consists of a massive, heavily reinforced steel basin filled entirely with river water. A 3,000-ton cargo ship sails directly into this floating pool, and massive, watertight steel doors slide shut to permanently seal the chamber. Once locked, a highly complex, computerized system of heavy concrete counterweights and massive hoists simultaneously engages. 4 giant, heavy-duty gear mechanisms, driven by multi-megawatt electric motors, begin to slowly turn, physically lifting the entire enclosed basin, including the water, the cargo, and the ship itself, weighing a staggering total of over 15,000 tons, straight up into the vertical sky. They lift this skyscraper-sized mechanical box over 100 meters in just 40 minutes, relying on microscopic engineering margins where a single slipping gear or a snapped steel cable would cause a catastrophic, fatal imbalance that would instantly rip the massive elevator completely off its structural guide tracks. Even with 27 million cubic meters of heavily cooled concrete, nearly 500,000 tons of high-tensile steel, and the absolute mastery of planetary physics and fluid dynamics. The Three Gorges Dam exists in a state of permanent, high-stakes siege. The ultimate threat to its existence does not merely come from the raging water pressing against its face, but from the deep, unstable geology of the Earth itself. The sheer, incomprehensible weight of the 39 billion-ton artificial reservoir constantly pushes violently down on the ancient subterranean fault lines traversing the valley. This immense pressure triggers a terrifying geological phenomenon known as reservoir-induced seismicity, where the sheer mass of the water violently lubricates and stresses the deep bedrock, causing constant, unnerving micro-earthquakes to continuously rattle the entire region. To monitor this invisible, underground war, structural engineers embedded tens of thousands of highly sensitive electronic sensors deep inside the cold concrete matrix during construction. Elaborate networks of plumb lines, electronic strain gauges, and deep water piezometers continuously monitor the internal core temperature, the microscopic structural deflection, and the minute geological shifts in the surrounding bedrock. The terrifying truth is that the dam actually physically moves. Under peak hydrostatic pressure during the height of the violent flood season, the massive crest of the concrete structure physically bends and bows downstream by several millimeters. It is explicitly engineered to bend and flex, but there is a strict, mathematical limit to its endurance. If a massive, unprecedented seismic event were to strike directly beneath the deep granite foundation, or if the internal concrete structural integrity were ever fatally compromised by unseen internal erosion, the resulting failure would instantly become the absolute greatest man-made disaster in the history of human civilization. 39 billion tons of trapped water would instantly detonate through the shattered valley, unleashing a terrifying 100-meter-tall wall of black, roaring water moving at the speed of a high-speed bullet train. This apocalyptic, inland tsunami would violently obliterate absolutely everything in its downstream path, instantly erasing major industrial megacities, annihilating critical national infrastructure, and claiming the lives of millions of innocent people within a matter of agonizing hours. The engineers operating the control rooms know this terrifying reality all too well, which is exactly why the electronic monitoring never, ever stops. Every single millimeter of structural deflection is aggressively analyzed by supercomputers, and every single drop of foundational seepage is meticulously measured and accounted for. The Three Gorges Dam is not just a massive hydroelectric power plant. It is a permanent, multi-generational engineering war against the relentless physics of water, the uncompromising force of gravity, and the literal rotation of the Earth itself. Humanity built a massive concrete wall to successfully choke an entire ocean of violent river water. They physically slowed the rotation of the planet to do it, and now, for every single second of every single day for the rest of foreseeable human history, that concrete absolutely must hold. There is zero tolerance for error, zero margin for fatigue, and absolutely zero room for failure, because the moment this massive structure gives way, the Earth will violently and mercilessly take its river back.